From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you all for coming to this event that's jointly sponsored by the Hispanic Division and the Hispanic Cultural Society, and which is a part of Hispanic Heritage Month. I want to point out also that in terms of Hispanic Heritage Month, that we will have our keynote address on Thursday at 11 o'clock. Ms. Angela Zavala, an independent businesswoman in the area, is going to speak to us in the Woodhull Pavilion. And then afterwards, there will be a selection of ethnic food, which I'm sure we're all looking forward to. We're very fortunate today to have with us Professor Judith Weiss to talk about a subject that I think she knows more about than anybody in the world at the moment. She is research professor and professor emerita of Hispanic Studies at Mount Alison University in Canada. She is the author of the first study of the Cuban intellectual review, Casa de las Americas, published in 1977, and of Latin American Popular Theater, The First 500 Years, 1993. She also translated and edited a series of Colombian plays, Colombian Theater in the Vortex, published in 2003. She's the author of a number of articles on Cuba and on Latin American theater, and for 12 years directed studies in productions of Hispanic drama in English at the Windsor Theater of Mount Allison University. As I have good reason to know, since I'm Barbara Tenenbaum, Specialist in Mexican Culture in the Hispanic Division, Judith has been a regular visit to the Hispanic Reading Room, much to our delight, where she's currently continuing her research on early 20th century Cuba. So it gives me enormous pleasure to welcome Professor Weiss to speak on Jose Antonio Ramos, a public intellectual of the First Cuban Republic. Professor Weiss. Almost made you Professor Ramos. Oh. I almost took a paper.
It's all right. I could improvise, I suppose. Well, I would like to thank Barbara for the introduction. Thank also Georgette Dorn and all my other colleagues at the Hispanic Division for their kind invitation. It's an honor to be speaking here, and it's also a special pleasure to be in this auditorium named for a fellow Canadian. I must also express my thanks at a distance to the colleagues of the Biblioteca Fernando Ortiz, Instituto de Literatura y Lingüística, and the director of the staff of the Cuban section and the manuscript section of the National Library of Cuba. My thanks, too, to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, which has funded this research project with a general grant. The goal of this project has been to gather and digitalize the letters, articles, and lectures of Jose Antonio Ramos, one of Cuba's most interesting intellectual figures of the early 20th century, and to edit and publish a representative selection of these texts. We hope to have the book out by 2011, but there will be no end to the process of gathering lost and scattered letters and manuscripts of Ramos and his correspondence, and of consolidating them in a digitalized collection, which we also hope to be able to save on microfilm eventually. With this in mind, I would like to take this opportunity to ask those present and those seeing this talk online to contact me, or feel free to contact the archivist at the Instituto de Literatura y Lingüística, Biblioteca Fernando Ortiz, if you have any leads at all. We're also seeking to trace Ramos's family inside and outside Cuba. So once again, the process of making the Ramos collection more complete is open-ended, and we welcome the contribution of anyone who may have information or documentation. Jose Antonio Ramos y Aguirre, 1885-1946, virtually unknown outside Cuba and the Cuban diaspora, nonetheless occupies a much-deserved place as a multifaceted figure in the world of Cuban letters and in the intellectual history of that Caribbean nation. He also had a strong connection to the United States and indirectly to this library. Ramos was a writer engaged with the issues of his time, a voracious and eclectic reader, and an autodidact until the age of 35. In many respects, he's representative of his generation, the generation of transition in the first decades of the newly constituted Republic of Cuba. But in other respects, he was quite a unique individual, especially as he evolved into more of an original thinker in his mature years. This contradictory relationship with his contemporaries and his country is one thing I would like to explore with you today. Ramos's work spans exactly 40 years, from the age of 21 until his untimely death at 61. Between his first novel, self-published in Paris in 1908, and his last play published in 1944, Ramos published 4 novels, 13 plays, 2 books of essays, close to 100 newspaper articles and reviews, and a dozen significant articles, essays, and the texts of lectures in some of the most reputable journals of his time, including Cuba Contemporánea, El Figaro, etc. He spent 20 years abroad in the consular service, 12 of them in the United States. Now, the contribution of most public figures in Cuba in the early part of the 20th century can be defined with somewhat greater precision than Ramos, because they were more focused and more specialized in a single literary genre, or because they worked in a limited number of fields. One could say that the lives of most of Ramos's peers were continuous narratives, whereas his was more of a discontinuous series of periods and moments, a zigzagging with certain constants and recurring themes. What drew me to Ramos was the passion that I discovered in his plays, in his correspondence, and in his diary, a passion for books, for ideas, for social change, and for friends. One unifying obsession of his life was the integrity of the soul of the Cuban nation. And although he was not a first-rank intellectual or a trained scholar, he was in many ways a worthy heir of Jose Marti and his national project. Most of Ramos's literary and dramatic works are uneven. Some are crippled in places by bombast or raw ideas unfiltered by artistic refraction. His articles and essays could be transparent and a delight to read, and others have convoluted thought and turgid prose. Still, he remains an attractive figure. Of course, Ramos was not unique in his overarching passion for constructing a Cuban national identity. And like most of his peers, Ramos explored more than one path to achieve that goal, with the difference that he explored more paths, perhaps, than most of his contemporaries. Because they came of age in the years of Cuba's transformation from colony to republic, Ramos and his contemporaries are considered a generation of transition. It's worth remembering, however, that there was no clean break between the first generation of the Republic and their forerunners and mentors, many of whom participated in the political, journalistic, academic, and artistic and scientific processes of the first years of the new Republic, after having laid the groundwork for the institutions of a sovereign nation between the 2 major wars of independence, 1868, 1898. And so, through 3 wars of independence in the 19th century, and in the 20th century through 2 military occupations by the US, 4 political upheavals, and economic booms and crashes, an extraordinary number of Cubans engaged in electoral politics, journalism, jurisprudence, academic careers, and as important sidelines, they edited literary journals and newspapers, formed cultural and civic associations, and built important institutions like the National Library, the National Archives, and the Cuban Academy of Arts and Letters. The younger, emerging intelligentsia most often worked alongside their mentors, that earlier generation. In the case of Ramos, it was probably Jose de Armas y Cárdenas, the Madrid-based Cuban journalist, who oriented him most in his readings, with a very, very intense correspondence between them. But the early philosophical outlook of Ramos, his anti-clericalism, his humanism, and his choice of the journalistic article to reflect on current issues, and particularly even the format of some of his columns, reflect the ideas and the writing of Enrique José Varona, 1849-1933, who was perhaps the most outstanding of these role models of the generation. Varona, a public figure, professor of philosophy, writer of spotless integrity, lived through every war of independence and exile and had a distinguished public career until the year the Platt Amendment was finally expunged from the Constitution. In the final decades of the 20th century, in the first decades of the 20th century, Cuban culture enters an accelerated period of modernization, which had begun earlier in other Latin American nations. It was a period which, in the words of the late scholar Angel Rama, quote, transcended a single aesthetic, a single school, or even a plurality of individual talents. In the cosmopolitanism of the late 19th century, which continued well into the 20th, one finds individual creativity and independence that is heavily influenced by European, specifically French, and to a lesser extent German literature and philosophy. But Cuba's historical circumstances led writers to other paths besides Paris, namely Madrid and New York. From the 1860s on, it became increasingly normal and almost normative for Cubans to be sent to further their studies in the United States, or, as was already the custom, in Spain. After the new republic was established, this trend continued, with a much greater inclination towards the US on account of its proximity and the degree of economic and cultural influence. The trajectory of the bourgeois and the petit bourgeois, that is to say, the process dominated by the educated elite who benefited most from capitalist investment and land holdings, is paralleled by the political and cultural evolution of the working class and the lower middle class, mostly through the efforts and struggle of socialists and anarchists, which, as Frank Fernandez and Kerwin Schaefer have documented, sometimes coincided and at certain junctures intersected with the efforts of students and journalists from the growing middle class and even the bourgeoisie. In the publication of the Cuban elite, however, including Ramos's, much of this struggle remains invisible or inimical. Yet it is significant to note that the growth of the trade union movement owes much to both the socialists and the anarchists. I mention this because in his later years, Ramos would become close to the socialist tendency and the Cuban Labor Federation, the CTC, which do not figure at all in the first 30 years of his writing or his private reflections. What I would like to illustrate today, what I hope to illustrate, is how Ramos exemplified this process of civic and cultural engagement of his class, while also standing apart and aside from some of his contemporaries at various points in his career. When Ramos embarked on his first journey abroad at the age of 21, it was not to pursue formal studies, as many of his peers had, but rather to immerse himself quite alone in the world of European culture. And in going first to Paris and then to Madrid, he followed the example of other Latin American writers rather than the path of his compatriots who were already tending towards the United States. Unlike other youth of his social class, he was not well-to-do. His father, who died when Ramos was 10, was a physician who moved his practice to the United States during the First War of Independence, and upon returning to Cuba distinguished himself as a professor at the University of Havana and as director of the Botanical Garden. He married a widow and had 2 children. When the father died, the Ramos children, Jose Antonio and his sister Pilar, did not enjoy the opportunity afforded many of his generation of completing a higher education or traveling to the United States. The widow was left in poverty after being swindled of her inheritance, and the family was also a victim of the economic disaster that befell many during the Spanish-American War. And so at the age of 16, Ramos went to work as a clerk in the Department of Public Works under the direct administration of Leonard Wood's occupation forces, where he quickly learned English and began to do translations. Reacting to the political upheaval of 1906 and the Second Intervention, Ramos quit his job and left for Europe, where he published his first novel and wrote 4 plays under the direct influence of Henrik Ibsen. On his return home, he started the theater section of La Prensa, a newspaper that he helped to found, and becomes a theater critic. The literate class, to which Ramos belonged both by birth and through his own ambitious efforts, organized itself as an influential intelligentsia over the years between 1902 and 1934, roughly. It was an intelligentsia made up of 2, even 3 generations, as I mentioned earlier. Some had fought in the war, others were returning from exile, some from the States, some from Spain, while others emerged from the autonomous movement that was initially opposed to independence and had to blend in, and very few still harbored fantasies of annexation to the US. The networks that formed with strands of the older generations and people of such differing political views would make a fascinating subject for a sociological analysis, but there's no time for that now. But of course, the dialogue on Cuban national identity was fraught because it involved many Cubans who had lived abroad and those who had lived through the last war inside Cuba, those who remained attached to Spain, to their Spanish roots, and those who identified openly with the US for what it offered the young nation. Cuban-American historians Lou Perez Jr. and Lilian Guerra And Cuban historians in the island, writing in the past 12 to 15 years, have laid the groundwork for studying relations among Cubans of different political orientations and how they work their way into the systems of power of the young republic. In business and trade, in Congress, the Senate, in newspapers, periodicals that they founded or took over from their elders, and of course in the diplomatic service. If one were to look at the diplomatic service with a jaded eye, one would say it was an attractive sinecure to which many aspired in the newly independent republic, as they did in other Latin American countries, and I dare say, speaking from my own country, probably other countries too. In a more positive light, however, we need to see it also as a vehicle for the intelligentsia to become better positioned to analyze Cuba's situation and to gauge perspectives for its international relations. And the consular postings meant both things to Ramos, who was given his first assignment in Madrid in 1911 when he was not quite 26. Ramos's contemporaries were by and large talented, keen, and intellectually broad men, mostly men, who often combined their main career in law, business, or medicine with different kinds of cultural agency, mainly as writers. Journalists, in particular, contributed to creating a well-informed national debate, if only by virtue of the very number of publications that flourished, and through divulgación, that is, making known the contributions of artists and writers and popularizing debates and ideological discourse. Ramos and others of his generation also played their part in founding literary supplements and setting standards for criticism. So it was in this medium that Ramos first establishes his credentials as a critic. Between 1909 and 1924, he wrote 4 series of crónicas, newspaper columns or short articles, which can now be read as chronicles of his own intellectual explorations. The quality of the journalism of the day varied considerably, and of course so did Ramos's. A number of his columns lacked depth or substance. They were clearly written to meet deadlines and to supplement his income. But even these have merit because they were effective in introducing Cubans to foreign artists, writers, and actors. It was Ramos's first series of articles and reviews, mainly about theater, in fact, that helped to establish his reputation and earned him a key reference for entry into the consular service. And so his subsequent 3 series of columns, reviews, and short articles were mostly written from abroad: Spain, 1913, New York, 1919, and Philadelphia and Havana in 1921-23. They kept him in much-needed spending money, but more importantly, they kept him visible within Cuba while he was abroad. There is more than a hint of this need of Ramos to be a player, even from a distance. We find that in his correspondence with Jose de Armas, the journalist and scholar residing in Madrid, who was his mentor at the time. Yet he did not advance through partisan politics, as some of his contemporaries did, but he saw himself fulfilling a broader role, relaying, interpreting ideas that could contribute to the cultural and political evolution of his society. Somehow he felt superior to the fray that he observed from afar, or perhaps he did not know that he would have been he did know that he would have been a failure in the world of politics. His early play, Caliban, 1914, overflows with ideals of a philosopher king, modeled perhaps on Enrique José Varona, to lead the country, ideals that Ramos knows will clash with the reality of power struggles. As he completed his advanced degrees in 1921, the quality and analysis of his columns matured considerably. In fact, his series, entitled Ni Pan ni Circo, Neither Bread Nor Circus, includes some of Ramos's most interesting contributions to the national debate and to the cultural enlightenment of the general reader. Most of his longer articles clearly derive from deep reflection and his broad readings. In the period immediately following his satirical 1917 Manual del Perfecto Fulanista, which has been recently reprinted in Cuba and in Miami, Ramos contributed several foundational articles, one on national theater, one on the need for civic education, and one on the economic sense of women's emancipation. In the 1920s and 30s, he published articles on U.S. economic relations with Cuba, on the integration of the American republics, and on Afro-Cuban letters. Ramos even ventured into the subject of land tenure, first in his powerful play Tembladera of 1916, which addresses land ownership as the basis for national sovereignty, and subsequently in articles on 2 major figures in Cuban agricultural history who were advocates of a national agricultural policy, the Count of Pozos Dulces, Francisco de Frias, and Francisco Javier Balmaceda. I said earlier that his analysis matured considerably by the 1920s, when he was better able to synthesize and distill his readings rather than simply reproduce their content. It's a weakness of a couple of his earlier essays, and certainly his early plays. His independence of thought, or at least his effort to achieve it, however, is already apparent in his early polemical articles, some of which he compiled in the book Entre Actos in 1913. Of particular interest, perhaps to this audience, was the position that Ramos took in the polemic about Latin America's relationship with the United States. In his 1912 essay, critiquing the Venezuelan poet and scholar Rufino Blanco Fombona, Ramos opposed what he considered Blanco Fombona's facile Arielismo, that demonization of U.S. materialism and an idealization of Latin America, which was based on a popularized interpretation of Ariel, the essay by the Uruguayan Jose Enrique Rodó. And over the years, Ramos continued to maintain a cool distinction between the deleterious effects of U.S. foreign policy and the most positive elements of the U.S. Republic. In fact, Ramos admired many U.S. writers, and he eventually published a historical survey of U.S. literature in Spanish in 1937. He was not only one of the very first to write about the importance of José Martí's thought, but he also expressed the same discretion exemplified by Martí himself in refusing to fall into an essentialist refutation of American exceptionalism and its imperial ambitions. The fact that Ramos offered one of the most balanced perspectives on the United States of any Latin American intellectual of his generation, and that he was not prone to criticizing the influential neighbor gratuitously or conversely, to admiring it slavishly, warrants a sidebar at this point. A little side trip to College Park, Maryland, and the Ramos file at the National Archives. The State Department file on Ramos was opened when Ramos was first named to the Cuban consulate in New York. This was, and I suppose still is, quite routine to send reports on foreign diplomats. And it can be a valuable resource for researchers, as I discovered. The very first note in the file is from a staff member of the U.S. mission in Lisbon, where Ramos was consul during World War I. In this 1918 report, Ramos is described as well disposed towards the United States, but his allegiance to the Allies had to be suspect because he was taking German lessons from the wife of a German neighbor in Lisbon and showed great interest in Germany, something the American informant found worrisome. This piece of information proved very useful to me because we already knew that Ramos had been interested in German thinkers and culture for a long time. In his diary and some newspaper columns, he records his admiration for the music of Wagner and for the writings of Nietzsche and the positivist political philosopher Max Nordau, who was also an ideologue of Zionism, both of whom he had presumably read in French or in English. Those German lessons must have served Ramos quite well, as we discover from his 1937 lecture on Rainer Maria Rilke, and from the manuscript of the translation he was working on of Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke. Of course, given Ramos's weakness for the opposite sex, one might speculate about other possible motives in taking German lessons from the Hausfrau next door. But what I find educational and a little frightening is the divergence between the more complex reality of Ramos's intellectual and creative life and the bureaucrat's failure to even recognize it. There is also a report from a consular official in Costa Rica citing a review that appeared in a Mexican newspaper of Ramos's Panorama de la Literatura Norteamericana, which was published in Mexico, in which Ramos is lauded as an anti-imperialist, another cause for alarm. In fact, while the book is largely biased towards progressive writers in the United States and the literature of social reform, it should be seen as greatly sympathetic towards the democratic project of the United States. The Ramos file in the National Archives includes several later reports, which, like that Lisbon note of alarm, tell us more about the workings of the bureaucratic mind and fear of criticism than they do about the subject himself. I call this slight deviation a tangent, but it's not irrelevant, because the file hints both at how unique and how unexceptional Ramos's diplomatic career was. It was in no way an unusual career path, and we know this. So many aspiring writers and intellectuals enter the diplomatic service in Cuba. And it was not an outstanding career. This fact is demonstrated by the fact he did not rise through the ranks, and he did not land plum postings like Buenos Aires, London, or Paris. But in 1937, Ramos was given a singular assignment as consultant in charge of organizing the holdings of the National Library in Havana. In fact, a few years later, he wrote the first handbook of library science and encouraged the establishment of the first school to train professional librarians, which was only accomplished after his death. And in collaboration with the Columbus Memorial Library of the Pan American Union here and the Library of Congress. He labored for 7 years to bring order out of cataloging chaos, running afoul of the board of directors and the chief librarian, Francisco de Paula Coronado. It was during this period that Ramos became the object of an anti-communist witch hunt, a result in part of his membership in the PSP and his public defense of the communist congressman, who included, I guess, Juan Marinello. This ideological rift is also the background for an extraordinary episode in his career, on which I will spend a little time here. It's a decision of Ramos's that effectively separated him from the cream of the establishment of artists and writers and many old friends. Ramos was elected to the Cuban Academy of Arts and Letters much later in life than some of his earliest friends and collaborators, a crowning mark of success and recognition that Ramos undoubtedly had waited for years. An old friend, Antonio Iraizos, inducted him into the Academy in 1937 with a speech that reveals details of Ramos's early life that we don't find in other sources. Iraizos' brief biography of Ramos distills the finest aspects of his work and his character, while it also hints at his unorthodox personality and the unevenness of the work. However, Ramos's affiliation with that most prestigious of elite institutions reached a crisis 5 years later, when the majority voted to induct a bright young journalist and economist called Raúl Maestri, who, in the words of the nomination, quote, carries on with dignity and brilliance the great tradition of Cuban journalism. Maestri was to occupy the seat of one of the founding members of the Academy, Ramón Catalá, who was recently deceased. As an aside, I should point out that Catalá's daughter, Raquel, an outstanding translator and intellectual in her own right, was a close friend of Ramos and a co-executor of his estate. At the time, José María Chacón y Calvo was president of the Academy. Medardo Vitier, distinguished historian, was the secretary. So Ramos roundly condemned the decision on the grounds that Maestri was or had been a supporter of Franco at the time of the rebellion against the Republic, and that as an assistant editor of the Diario de la Marina, Maestri remained clearly pro-fascist. Ramos's long vitriolic letter of resignation followed the confrontation at the discussion of Maestri's nomination, when Ramos threw his academic insignia down on the table and stormed out of the room. His resignation marked a radical break with many of his past associates, some of whom had been his close friends for years, and it left an indelible wound in them. So much so that when Ramos died 4 years later, the event was not even recorded in the bulletin of the Academy or mentioned in the minutes, even though Ramos was buried with full state honors. At the time of the disagreement, Ramos had been engaged in a very nasty polemic with the Diario de la Marina, where Maestri was the assistant editor. He went so far as to insult the editor personally in letters that today would not even come close to being published. Trying to veto Maestri was a logical extension then of his very personalized political fight with that right-wing publication. However, Ramos was not entirely off the mark if we look at the context. In this vehement protest against the nomination, in which he refused to sacrifice his principles to some need to remain friends with the members of the Academy, who in his view were flirting openly with fascism. One case in point was Iraizos, the same friend who had presented him to the Academy, an old friend, a journalist with whom Ramos had exchanged letters of deep love and trust 30 years earlier, and who was now clearly on the opposite side of the deep ideological divide of the late 30s. In fact, as ambassador to Panama in the early 40s, Iraizos waxed enthusiastic about the fascist government of President Arnulfo Arias. So the problem went well beyond the Diario de la Marina and the Academy. By 1940, it was quite apparent that the Nazis, as well as Mussolini's fascists, and of course Franco's effective propaganda machine, were all aligned to subvert Latin American democracies, to fight US and British influence by proxy, and to encourage staunchly conservative intellectuals to strengthen and validate a pro-Axis fifth column in various Latin American countries, including Mexico and Cuba. Ramos's grand gesture can therefore be seen as one of the few honorable public calls to end the honeymoon between the European right and Latin American intellectuals. It may well have been misplaced, given Maestri's credentials, but like all of Ramos's public stances, at least it was honest. As a writer, Ramos followed a more eclectic path than most of his peers, the scholars, essayists, novelists, and playwrights who for the most part contributed to a single chosen genre. Ramos was not the single discipline type and not the single genre type. Hence, while he dovetails with a variety of public figures, he also deviates from the norm. I will give just a few examples. As a novelist, Ramos has been compared to two other writers of the transitional generation, the journalist Carlos Lobeira and the physician Miguel de Carrion, authors of some of the most solid naturalist fiction in Latin America. Both Carrion and Lobeira wrote social novels to raise awareness of conditions in the early years of the Republic. Unlike them, Ramos, however, undertook to write fiction on rather abstract political themes, and his novels are not so successful in conveying artistically the concepts he tried to communicate. But in his last novel, Caniqui, 1935, a work of maturity, he did achieve artistic excellence with a rich and accurate portrayal of slavery, which is still considered one of Cuba's finest historical novels. As a playwright, Ramos went essentially unchallenged for years, given that most of his peers turned to fiction, poetry, or the essay. Figures like Paco Alfonso and Luis Baralt Jr. emerged later, two playwrights who, unlike Ramos, were singularly devoted to their craft and were also directly involved in production work, which Ramos was not. There were public intellectuals, though, to whom Ramos could conceivably be compared. And we can measure his trajectory as a public figure against those of perhaps three contemporaries I have picked as examples. The first is Fernando Ortiz, a younger man, one of Cuba's best-known scholars. Actually, he was born the same year as Ramos, 1885. Ortiz studied criminology in Italy. He became a pioneer in ethnology and essentially the founder of Afro-Cuban studies. His distinguished academic career was in the area of the ethnology of Cuban culture. Now, he actually published his first book the very same year as Ramos, 1913, also a collection of essays on Cuban issues. Ortiz, however, was already more narrowly focused and with a greater depth of analysis than Ramos, who published a scattered compilation on a variety of topics on culture. So we can see from the very beginning the divergence, right? Fernando Ortiz diverged from Ramos politically at least once at the time that Ramos was hesitating about quitting his post as consul in Philadelphia during the Machado regime. Ortiz was very active in opposition to President Machado and actually lobbied strongly against the granting of a $50 million loan from US banks, and also was pressuring Ramos to resign from the diplomatic corps. And yet, at the same time, Ortiz was essentially in the same boat as Ramos. They were both engaged in an intense but vain search for academic appointment in the US so they could leave Cuba. And like Ramos, he ran into the reality of the Great Depression, which had led to hiring freezes in most universities. The second figure is Antonio Iraizos, who I'd mentioned earlier, who was the editor-in-chief of La Noche, where Ramos published his first series of articles. As an author of essays, monographs on cultural topics, a journalist, he ascended to the post of Grand Master of the Freemasons of Cuba at the height of the Machado regime, and had distinguished himself for the number of duels he fought. He also served in the diplomatic corps, becoming ambassador. The only one of the three who left Cuba after 1959, interestingly. Juan Marinello, the third, a political activist who wrote and spoke ardently in defense of public education and against the influence of religious schools, also wrote extensively on Cuban art and culture, and established a reputation as a leading Jose Marti scholar in the 50s and 60s. So all three multifaceted figures built their careers quite systematically, gradually and systematically, and for the most part, evenly and consistently. Not so Ramos. What we're left with in the end is a blurry picture of a writer who often would opt unaccountably for a particular genre, and who came across just as often as a dilettante, an amateur. But I don't use the term disparagingly or to mean simply a dabbler. Quite the contrary. I prefer to see Ramos as dilettando, delighting in, falling in love with drama, fiction, and journalism at various points, a kind of Casanova of genres, as he was of his subjects. Ramos would also have been delighted to read Edward Said's confession, quote, "I speak and write about broader matters because as a rank amateur, I am spurred on by commitments that go well beyond my professional career." In his unpublished diary, Ramos wrote in 1918 of the urge always to be something else. At that time, he thought he had the vocation to be a historian, but acknowledged that he was too ill-prepared. This, ironically, from a voracious reader who sopped up philosophy, literature, and political theory like a sponge, but still had not completed his university degrees. The phrase "something else" actually defines quite well what Ramos always seemed to be aiming for, and what he succeeded in part in becoming. Once again, to use Said's words, a man capable of confronting orthodoxy and dogma rather than producing it. And he did this abundantly through his life. He was known for his mercurial temper, but also respected and tolerated for his integrity and honesty in calling out whatever seemed false or irrational. He was also deeply ambivalent about small p politics in his country, which always had the nation lurching this way and that way for most of his adult life. And he was basically ambivalent about the role he himself could play, although he had a tendency to make very definitive pronouncements on a number of things, which he perhaps didn't know that much about. And so I will attempt to continue. If engagement in an intellectual implies activism, then Ramos came into his own quite late in life as a committed intellectual in the sense that Gramsci and Sartre conceived the term. In the first half of his career, he expressed his engagement through the societies that he founded and supported, one for the promotion of theater, another for civic education, and through his writings as a cultural activist rather than through partisan politics. Ramos had started out as a late positivist, convinced of the possibilities of modernization and progress in a society free from superstition and irrational fears, while he wrestled only indirectly with the small p politics of the first quarter century of the Republic. He seemed always to be making up for the time he had lost before he was able to complete his formal education, especially because he had always aspired to being recognized as a writer in the service of his country. And he said that even that's why he wrote plays, that's why he wrote novels. This may sound a little cliched, a little naive, but it is in fact what motivated many of his generation to a greater or lesser degree. Although the term intellectual was not yet common currency, Ramos and his peers, individuals concerned with ideas, with theories and praxis, were successors of a line of erudite citizens engaged in furthering Cuba's sovereignty, in affirming her dignity, and in bettering the lives of her population. Teachers and writers who for later generations had come to embody the virtue of the political person. In other words, what we might call public intellectuals today. The contributions of many of Ramos's most distinguished contemporaries, as I said earlier, can be defined with more clarity and precision, perhaps, because they were focused and they built on continuities. Ramos's achievements are a discontinuous series with constants running through them and with recurrent themes. Because of this, there is also an uneven quality in his work, sometimes a lack of clarity of purpose or an extreme opinion. There are influences that run through his writing that Ramos does not acknowledge directly, and where he does note his sources, such as the playwright Ibsen or the political theorist Bluntschli, there can be more than a whiff of plagiarism in some of his earlier works, something I have not entered into today, but which I wanted to mention because it is one more element that makes him quite difficult to study sometimes. Still, he never ceased to be an engaged writer and an engaging personality. Today, it is so refreshing and so very heartening to see young people in Cuba and in the diaspora rediscover figures like Ramos, be it through a play, an essay, even an isolated complaint about the Cuban character or the state of Havana's streets. because it is his values and his passion that attract them and will inspire them, we hope, to move back from the disengagement that has afflicted them on both sides of the Florida Straits. Thank you very much. Questions, comments? See. Oh, okay. That's it. Yes, he was born in 1885, the same year as Ortiz, and he died in 1946 in August. He was born in April 85 and died in August 46. Yes, he married first. Yeah, he married Mercedes. He married when he was 20. Proceeded to take off for Europe for a year. His wife wasn't with him. And he came back, and they had a son in 1910, I believe, Hector. They had a really unhappy marriage. It was just up and down and back and forth. Finally, when Hector was older, he managed to get a divorce, I think, finally, some kind of settlement for Mercedes, who was not, I don't think, quite very well. And then he met a younger poet, Josefina, oh my God, who he married in 1938, I believe, and he was very, very happy with her. Speculating that perhaps it was the insecurity that he had all the time, not only from his childhood poverty, but the fact that he was always so concerned about providing for his wife and son, that might have been what kept him in the first years from really engaging, and he was afraid of losing that job. Like when Ortiz was pressuring him to quit, it's like he didn't quit until he managed to work out some kind of a pension for his wife, and then he went into exile in Mexico in 1932, right? He was always, I think, bedeviled by that. And then once he was free of that, in a sense, he joined the Socialist Party. He became much more engaged directly, I think, and less afraid. Interesting. So it's kind of sad. His very last trip here was in the beginning of 1946, and he went back to Harvard and back to Yale libraries and came to the Library of Congress to update his book, because he wanted desperately to put out a second edition of his History of American Literature, because the first one he felt was a sloppy edition. The one had been put out in Mexico, and he really desperately wanted to get a good second edition. But he was already sick. He'd had a few minor strokes, and he finally died before he could finish it. So we actually found some of the call slips from the Harvard Library and the collections of stories that he was looking at, the latest collections of American stories and fiction. So there's something sort of sad about it. The other interesting thing is that he was probably blacklisted by the FBI, according to something in the file. However, the cards were pulled, so he actually came back in 1943, probably on a consular visa, at the Anti-Fascist Writers' Conference in Los Angeles in 1943, and he gave a paper there. And then again came back at the beginning of 1946 on his own as a researcher. And actually the very last photograph, which I don't have a copy of here, but is in the archives in Cuba, is the very last known photograph of him is of himself with the Capitol in the background when he came to the Library of Congress. So I thought that was a nice touch, very sad. Anyway, any other comments or questions? Yes, ma'am.
The second edition, did anyone keep those transcripts, or does anyone know where it's at?
Well, this is interesting. No, there is a scholar in Cuba who started to work on that, Ana Suarez, who is associated with the Instituto de Cultura Juan Marinello, which is an independent institute. And I believe Arte Público Press had one of the grants they had was for the reedition of that book. Nothing ever came of it. I heard of this about 4 or 5 years ago. I think next time I go down, I'll ask Ana Suarez how it's going, but it was a touchy thing. I think she finally found some of the papers, but I know she had gone back to the New York Public Library and a few other places where he'd been doing his research to try and fill in the gaps, and then publish the second edition through Arte Público Press. So there's a link to Hispanic heritage for you. It's kind of odd that Arte Público would be planning to publish a history of U.S. literature by a Cuban writer, right? However, I hope to see it come to light one of these days. Yeah. Thank you. I could give you the contact if you wish for Ana Suarez, if you're interested. She's at the Instituto de Juan Marinello. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
What 20th century Cuban writers have been picked up by Cuban intellectuals and scholars? Who people are working on, in other words. Which are the ones-
Many.
Many.
What? Certainly Marinello. Certainly, certainly Ortiz's work, Marinello's work, Portuando's work. They periodically put out collections of their. You're talking about intellectuals or writers? They're re-editing. They've re-edited Ramos's novels periodically. There are interesting collections coming out of letters, which is something I'm using partly as a model for our book, which is going to be a collection of essays and articles of his. So the correspondence of a number of writers, so obviously Nicolás Guillén, Marinello, Ortiz, Portuondo.
Carpentier.
Carpentier's also, yes. I think Carpentier's work's now being re-edited. So, drawing a blank. Any other? Yes, see.
Did he ever write poetry?
Interestingly enough, no. Not that we know of. No, it's interesting. So here's we found this, penciled manuscript of his translation of Letters to a Young Poet by Rilke, right? And he writes this wonderful lecture on Rilke. Haven't found any poems of his. Perhaps he knew that he was not as good for poetry, just as he wasn't good for politics. I don't know. It's interesting. I don't know of any poems of his.
The only translation of Letters to a Young Poet it's his translation? That's the only
No, it hasn't been published. No, there have been translations since then, published in Spanish, of course.
Okay.
Yeah, but he was obviously working on it. No, we don't know. I mean, we're not sure what the year is. We think it's late 20s, early 30s, but we're not sure. No date on it. Just in the archives. Yes, sir.
Pardon me, you mentioned that you are organizing a volume for publication.
Yes.
Where will that be published?
Well, probably be published by the Instituto de Literatura y Lingüística in Havana, because they basically have the rights at this point, and perhaps jointly with the National Library, where some of the manuscripts are too. So they're working out an agreement where, at some point in the 60s, all the Ramos papers got split when many of the holdings of the Biblioteca Fernando Ortiz were going to be transferred to the National Library. And then somehow, 2 boxes of scrapbooks and letters and got transferred to the National Library, were never actually processed. So when I went back when I was there about 4 years ago, I asked for them, looked at them, and consulted them, and we discovered they hadn't been processed, which is very dicey, especially today with a tendency for things to disappear. Fortunately, the head of the manuscript section is now working with the director, with Olga Vega, who is the wonderful director of the Cuban collection at the library. And they're processing them now, and the Instituto de Literatura and the library will collaborate on digitalizing everything, so they will be available in both places for scholars.
Are they willing to do that from here? Are they sending that information here? Or are we sending people there to as you said, to process?
No, they're processing it themselves. This is the National Library of Cuba and the Instituto de Literatura Lingüística de Biblioteca Fernando Ortiz, which have most of the manuscripts and the rights. Now, it's interesting, the manuscript of the diary, handwritten manuscript of all the notebooks, ended up at the National Library, and the Instituto de Literatura has the typed version, right? So we've been looking at both. I have I managed to get digitalized copies to look at, and there's big controversy about, a colleague thinks that the diary should be published because it's very interesting. It's got many, many interesting reflections, certainly about his readings and about his ideas. However, there's a lot of personal stuff there too, which probably should not be published. And he specifically said in a cover page that if there are literary scholars interested in reading it, it should be made available, but he did not want that diary to be published. So we'll see. There's also the sad thing that his very first diary was was disappeared. That is, his first wife burned it when she found it, 1917. And there must have been 10 years of really, really interesting stuff in there, because his early readings were all in there, and his reflections. Unfortunately, all his adventures and his Casanova love affairs were in there too. And so Mercedes got really pissed off and burned it. So we lost quite a wealth of material there. But the diary is interesting. Some fragments have been published, the fragments about politics and about literature. One section was published in 1961, 61 in Cuba. And interestingly, the other two major scholars, researchers who know Ramos and loved Ramos long before I even discovered Ramos. And one, of course, is Francisco Rodriguez Aleman, who taught at the University Central de las Villas in Santa Clara, and happens to have a ton of manuscripts that the widow had lent him 25 years ago for his thesis. And he's the main biographer of Ramos, a wonderful man who's slowly passing all these manuscripts back to the Biblioteca Fernando Ortiz, to the archives. So I've been working with him too, and come across some very interesting letters and fragments, and he put together some parts of the diary. And the other one is Matias Montes Huidobro, who's emeritus of Hawaii and now lives in Miami, who with Yara Montes, his wife, published a very, very neat sort of little book about 3 or 4 years ago, fragments of the sentimental part of his diary with Josefina Cepeda, his love, declarations of love for Josefina Cepeda, his second wife, who died in the late 80s, I believe. And Matias and Yara knew Josefina, who had given them copies of this section. So they did a reflection on it. It was like a cross dialogue that was published in Miami a few years ago, which is quite touching, sentimental piece. So Matias Montes Huidobro and Yara knew Josefina de Cepeda. Francisco Rodriguez Aleman knew Josefina de Cepeda, who was very generous in lending a lot of materials. So some of Ramos's materials are scattered, and one of the reasons we're trying desperately to try and bring them together. Also trying to find his relatives. We know he had a granddaughter from Hector, probably living in the States, but nobody seems to be able to track her down. So I've tried People Finder, and hasn't worked. So it's... surely there are letters of Ramos's in somebody's personal collection that would be very interesting, because we actually have letters received by Ramos from a number of people, but we don't have the corresponding copy of Ramos's letters, which would be nice to have. So, any other comments? Any criticism you'd like to make? Yes.
Is he known, his contribution to the theater in Latin America, is it important?
It's interesting. I first came across Ramos in an anthology by Gerardo Luzuriaga, put together a very, very good anthology of Latin American theater, and I used that as a textbook, and fell in love with Tembladera, which is still a very, very solid play. 1916, 17, won a prize, and still probably his best play. Some of his later plays are okay, they're good, but nothing quite like Tembladera, a good naturalist play, right? So it's probably the only work of his that's really known, I'd say, outside of Cuba very well. And I think it's interesting. People read it and find it very, very topical, because it deals with the danger of letting go of the property of the land, which is where sovereignty resides, right? A sugar growing family that decides to sell its property and just get rid of this white elephant, and how the daughter and a couple of the other characters managed to struggle to keep it in the family and keep it from being sold to foreigners. I think today, given what's happening in Cuba and the changes and the transitions now, that play should probably be put on. Anyway, yes, comment? Okay. Yes, sir. Okay.
Brief observation.
Please, sir.
The University of Florida Library.
Yes.
And someone requested an interlibrary loan of Entre Actos.
Mm-hmm.
And we decided that our copy was too fragile to loan, so we
Mm-hmm.
digitized it.
Good.
And those of you who are interested in looking at it, I know
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned
Yes.
interesting work. So, looking at the evolution of his thinking.
Yes.
If you go to the University of Florida Library catalog and type in
Mhm.
Entre Actos Ramos, you'll find a link to.
So this is Gainesville, yes. Yes, thank you. Yes. I think a number of them have been digitalized and they're being printed. Actually, it's interesting. They're appearing on the web, some in Cuba and some in the States. As I said, El Manual del Perfecto Fulanista was reprinted both in Miami and in Havana. Obviously has a lot of interest too. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Professor Weiss.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Weiss. This gives you an idea of the wonderful scholars that we get in the Hispanic Reading Room. And, of course, we look forward to hearing any addenda to this and finding out what's come forward. And we hope that you will soon find additional materials on Ramos, and which will enlighten us further as to his thought and activities. Thank you again.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.